Okay, we have hit the magic number of 20 separate lines, and we know that there's more people out there, so thank you because of the groups that are in some conference rooms out there. So we are going to go ahead and begin. So again, can everybody hear me, and does everybody have the presentation up on their screens?
Yeah. Good hearing you have us, Sue.
Hey, Martha.
Good, good. So, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and begin, and we're going to go ahead and mute you all right now, and then we will unmute you towards the end, and you can answer or ask any questions at that point. Please do not put us on hold. If you need to, because then all of a sudden we do hear your hold music, so if you do have to put us on hold, please hang up, do what you ever have to do, and then come back and re-log in, if you would.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
Okay, so we are going to begin. I thought the forms that we would do today are the assumption/carryback addendum forms. We have an AAR form, which you should be seeing up on your screen, and we also have a Coldwell Banker form that is required on all carrybacks. The reason I decided to do this form is because we are starting to see more carrybacks, and I think it's because of the market. We're seeing, interestingly, we're seeing carrybacks on high-end properties, million-plus properties, but we're also seeing them as low as a couple $100,000 properties, and I think a lot of that might have to do with buyers that have had a recent foreclosure or a recent short sale and have some cash for a down payment but can't necessarily get qualified with a regular lender in order to get a loan on the property, and so they are requesting the seller to do a carryback addendum, which is fine. Obviously, they're all legal. We know that there are hairs on carrybacks, which we're going to go over. And I also want to give you just a little bit of past history of what almost happened regarding carrybacks and future on what's going to probably happen with carrybacks. It actually stems back to 2011. The FTC, I shouldn't really say the FTC, but the federal government came up with a new consumer watch group, which is called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which used to be, the FTC kind of looked over the consumer protection for the public. So in 2011, they came out with this new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and for some of you on the line might have remembered the whole Mars debacle we had regarding short sales and how the feds were essentially mandating we used certain forms on short sales, and it really was a debacle, and thank goodness it didn't last very long. During that time is when the CFPB, again, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, came about back in 2011. And they're a consumer watch group. They want to make sure that consumers are not being taken advantage of by lenders, credit card companies, et cetera, et cetera. Well, actually part of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is thousands and thousands of pages long, and it seems like every time we turn around, it somehow is affecting how we do real estate. But one of the things in the Dodd-Frank Act that came about that was supposed to go into law, so to speak, last January was the changes on seller carrybacks. And those changes would essentially completely change the way sellers can do carrybacks. And one of the main reasons, don't ask me even how they would know that this was the case, but one of the main changes is that you cannot have a balloon payment in a seller carryback anymore, that the loan had to be amortized over the full amount of years. So if normally seller carrybacks in general had a 5-year balloon on them, they'd maybe amortize the loan over 30 years and have the payments reflect that, but then the full balloon would be due in 5 years. Well, according to these new rules that were supposed to go into effect, there could not be a balloon. It had to be paid over the period of the amortized amount of months, and the seller had to go through many, many hoops, just like a lender does today, on qualifying that particular buyer for their carryback. They had to do such things as require current income or assets, current employment status, credit history, et cetera, et cetera. So this was going to be very difficult for an individual member of the public, if you will, seller, on setting up a seller carryback. So thankfully, the CFPB, again, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, decided to hold off on these new rules regarding seller carrybacks. However, it does look like they are going to go into effect this next January, specifically January 10th, 2014. So we did get a year's reprieve, but it looks like this is not going away. So seller carrybacks, as we know them, will be changing dramatically within essentially the next 6 months. So there'll be more to come on that. AAR will have to pull their form and try to revise their form, get it back so it can be back online with zip forms and be in compliance with the new rules, and we will have to change our form as well. And as is typical with the federal government, sometimes we may not know to the last minute whether or not they will be implementing this rule effective January 10th, 2014, or whether there'll be another reprieve. So I just wanted to give you some background history, and because I do have questions every once in a while on, hey, has the seller carryback rules changed? Currently they have not, but it does look like at this point they will be changing effective January of 2014. So that all being said, I am going to start going through the assumption/carryback addendum form, and as you can see on the form, it really should be called the carryback/assumption form, because they do reference seller carryback financing first and don't get into the assumption part of the form until the second page. So you can see at first that we have that, as a little backup, first, if you're going to be doing a carryback on the purchase contract, lines 74, 75 of the purchase contract says type of financing, and one of those options, the boxes that would be checked, would be the seller carryback box, which is on line 74 of the purchase contract. So once that's marked, then you have obviously the loan amount. Then you also have the priority loan. Is it going to be in first position or second position? The type of financing instrument, and you can see by default, essentially it says buyer shall execute a promissory note and deed of trust in favor of seller and record the deed of trust according to against the premises. I'm going to see if I can blow this up a little bit in case you're having some problems reading what's on the screen. Hopefully that's a little bit better. Let me try it a little bit more. It's too big. Let me bring it back down a little bit. Okay. So then we have the interest rate. And you can see as we go line by line, this gets pretty technical, so this is not something I would recommend a newer agent to put together for their seller or for their buyer, because it does get pretty complex. So you have the interest rate. The unpaid balance shall bear interest at the rate of blank % per year beginning at the close of escrow. The next line is payment intervals. The first payment is due blank month, day, and year, and then the payments will be monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, or other. Then it also says the payments on this loan shall be made at least 10 days prior to the due date of any periodic payment due on any other prior encumbrances. So meaning if there's a first in place or going to be in place, then the boilerplate of the form does say that the payments on this carryback shall be due at least, or shall be paid at least 10 days prior to the due date of the periodic payment on that other mortgage or that first mortgage. As we know, the carrybacks are almost always in second position, and that's where obviously the risk to the seller is. I've never known a carryback to be in first position, and essentially the reason why it can't be in first position is there is policies in almost all lender loans, on first loans essentially, or lender loans, that says they will not, repeat, will not subordinate to any other loan. So they will always stay in first position. And that's the agreement that the purchaser at the time, when they received their loan or got their loan from their lender, they agreed to, obviously, their loan documents that they would not have this subordinate to any other loan. So we have line 14. It says account servicing. Payments on this loan and all prior encumbrances shall be made concurrently through a single servicing account to be maintained by a duly licensed account servicing agent. This is, I want to say normally, but I know of no other time when it is not handled by a title company. Title companies can be servicing agents. That being said, not all title companies will do this. For instance, equity title, I don't believe that it will be interested in servicing any type of carryback account. I do know that there are other title companies like Stewart Title that will be account servicers on these types of loans. The parties hereby instruct servicing agent not to accept any payment without all other concurrent payments. So essentially what a buyer would do under a carryback is they would pay the servicing agent on the carryback, and then in the case where there is a first loan that the buyer obtained at the time of purchasing, then the buyer is making one payment directly to their lender, and then there is the second payment that is going to be directly paid to the servicing agent. In cases of wraparounds, where they are legal, and that's again where the assumption comes in, a wraparound, for some of you that may not remember this from real estate school, a wraparound is when the buyer assumes the seller's existing first loan. And for example, let's say the property is being sold for $300,000 and there's a $200,000 first loan. So the buyer says to the seller, hey, I'll go ahead and assume your first $200,000 loan, and Mr. Seller, will you carry the extra $100,000? And obviously the risk here is the buyer's given no money up front. But whatever they give, let's say the buyer says, well, I'll give you $50,000, and will you carry $50,000? In any case, now you've got, assuming this is all legal, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, so you've got a first being assumed, and then you have a seller carryback being in the second position. And these particular cases, the wraparound comes when the buyer is making one payment, and one payment only, to a servicing company, like a title company, and then that title company then cuts two checks, one to the lender for the first loan, and then another one to the seller on the carryback. And that's what they mean by concurrent payments. So it goes on to say that setup and servicing fees shall be paid by buyer or seller or other, an account to be serviced by whomever it is. And again, usually it is a title company. Line 18 says payment amount or more, including the above stated interest. Obviously, it's going to be principal and interest. And this note will or will not require payment of impounds as follows. In addition to and at the time of the above stated regular payment, buyer shall pay an amount equal to 1/12 the annual real estate tax, and 1/12 the annual insurance premium, and 1/12 the annual assessment, or as you can see in the form, it says other. That may, again, only be in a case where it is a wraparound and possibly where the first is not impounding for the insurance premiums or the real estate taxes, and obviously most lenders don't impound for annual assessments, which would be like HOA assessments, et cetera. We then have the loan term, amortized over how many years. If a balloon payment, principal balance due on or before blank. Again, obviously this is going to be changed potentially due to Dodd-Frank in January. Interest-only payments with principal balance due on or before blank. And remember, we're going to have this all tied to a note and deed of trust that will be recorded at the time of closing. Loan payments, if late, buyer shall pay a late fee, yes or no. Why wouldn't they? If yes, payments which are at least blank days past due shall be subject to a late fee of blank. If any balloon payment is late, then the late fee per day will be blank. Any late payments received without applicable late charges shall be accepted by the account servicing agent, and unpaid late charges shall be accumulated as a separate balance that shall not accrue interest. That's boilerplate. So if there's going to be any changes in that, then obviously they're going to be written into the additional terms and conditions on the second page. Default rate. Again, see, you can see it's getting pretty technical. Default rate of payments is or are at least 30 days past due, then the principal balance shall bear interest at a default rate of 5% over the interest rate as stated on line 10. So 5% plus whatever the interest rate is on line 10. The default rate shall begin on the 31st date following the due date of the payment or payments until payment or payments is or are brought current. Payments is or are first applied to accrued interest and penalties and then to the principal. Credit evaluation, always, always, always. In fact, I'm not even sure why there is an option here, but always, always. You're going to want to make sure that the seller has a credit report run on the buyer, because even if the buyer is getting a loan on the first and the seller is going to be in second position, the seller wants to make sure that they're agreeable to the buyer's credit history. So always, 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 anytime you see the word carryback, it should equal credit report. So again, I don't know why they give you an option here, but it should always be is contingent upon seller's approval of buyer's credit. If contingent, buyer shall provide to seller a current credit report from a credit reporting agency and a completed loan application on the current Fannie Mae form within 5 days after acceptance of this contract. I don't think that a seller should accept a buyer's credit report. I think the seller should get a credit report on behalf of the buyer, and as you know, our company policy is we can run the credit reports and we send them directly to a seller just like we would to a landlord in a landlord-tenant situation. Reasonable disapproval of buyer's credit request within notice, requires written notice from seller to escrow company within 5 days after receipt of seller of current credit report and completed loan application. Approval will not be unreasonably held. I love the word unreasonably. Reasonably and unreasonable, as we know, are subjective words. Due on sale. Again, I'm not sure why there is an option here. The loan is or is not due on sale of the premises. I don't know why. Is not would never, ever be marked. So as far as I'm concerned, it would be loan created is due on the sale of the premises. Once the premises sells, that loan should be paid off. If loan created herein is due on sale of premises, the promissory note and deed of trust shall provide that the promissory note and the deed of trust become immediately due and payable in the event that the premises are sold, transferred, or conveyed in any manner. Buyer's liability. On certain qualified residential property, the seller understands that under Arizona law, the buyer may have no personal liability in case of default, and that the seller's only recourse may be the property as the sole and exclusive source for repayment of the debt. So what does this mean? This means, let's say you've got a first loan, and or it's a wraparound, a legal wraparound, and then the buyer defaults on the first loan, whether it's on the assumed loan or on the first loan, and so the lender then comes in and forecloses on the first loan. And again, remember this carryback is in second position, so we all know that since this is in second position, they have no recourse and have no say on what the first lender does. And if the first lender does foreclose, takes back the property, and the seller then loses everything, has no recourse whatsoever, and the only thing they do have would be the potential of foreclosing themselves on the carryback and having to take over all payments on that assumed loan, but may not have that option to do that if the buyer took out a first loan. So this is where the risk on a seller carryback essentially is. Buyer shall furnish to seller at buyer's expense a standard loan policy in the full amount of any loan carried back by seller and secured by the real property described in line 3 on this addendum. So again, there is going to be a lien recorded against the property. Such standard loan policy shall show that seller's lien has the priority agreed to by the parties. But again, they can't, the priority of the loan can't be above the first loan on the property. Now also understand that, let's say you've got a situation where the seller owns the house free and clear. Buyer says, you know what, Mr. Seller, I just went through a foreclosure or a short sale or a divorce or whatever the case is. You know, I've got some cash, but my credit is lousy, so I can't go to a standard lender and get a loan on this property, but Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, would you agree to be my lender? There is no other lender going to be involved whatsoever. So the seller may say, well, sure, because maybe for whatever reason, tax consequences or whatever, the seller says, well, I don't necessarily want to check for $300,000 at close of escrow. I'd much prefer a check on a monthly basis, and I will just be the bank. Again, perfectly legal, no problem with that, and they are the one and only loan on that property. They would probably, under that particular situation, want to agree in writing that that particular loan, that particular carryback, will always stay in first position. If the buyer decides to go get a subsequent loan at another time against the property, the seller's carryback, the seller's loan, will always stay in first position. So again, you want to make sure that that would be in writing. Taxes. In the absence of taxes of a tax impound account, buyer shall provide and pay for tax service contract over the life of this loan, which will provide a delinquency notice to seller or any successor in interest to the seller of unpaid taxes. Because again, if the buyer doesn't pay taxes, and let's say it's over a long period of time before there's a balloon on this, then there is a potential that there actually could be a tax sale on the property, and unbeknownst to the seller, they could lose the property, and which would ultimately go to the purchaser on this tax sale. So they want to make sure that the seller's notified if the taxes are not paid. Insurance. Buyer shall provide and maintain and deliver to seller hazard insurance satisfactory to and with loss payable to seller, and at least the amount of all encumbrances against the premises. This provision shall be made a part of the language of the deed of trust. Again, lots of language is going to be in that deed of trust. So now we go to the assumption. So let's say the buyer says, hey, I can't get a loan. Can I assume your existing loan, Mr. Seller? Well, we all know that there's one sentence in almost all loans these days, and that's called the due on sale clause. And anytime you see due on sale, obviously the seller is prohibited by the agreement to allow a buyer to assume their existing loan without either the permission of the lender or without the buyer qualifying. Now, some lenders will say, we will allow assumption, but the buyer will have to qualify. So now you got a seller and buyer says, well, what happens if we just don't tell the lender? You know, I'll go ahead and assume your loan. You know, why does the lender care? They're still going to get paid. They're going to get paid on a monthly basis. They're not even going to look to see who's paying them. As long as they get paid, there shouldn't be a problem. All the lender has to do is find out by checking the assessor's records or however they want to do it, and if they find out that that particular property has been sold, transferred, or conveyed in any way, they can call that loan due. Again, this is where the risk to the seller also could potentially come in. So, and what is this? Okay, the agreement says, hey, there's a due on sale clause. You are prohibited, Mr. Seller, from conveying this property in any form or fashion without our knowledge and our permission. If they go ahead and do it, that is what we call mortgage fraud or lender fraud. If you as the agent say, hey, you guys do what you want, you know, that's fine. I'm not a mortgage person. I don't know anything about what's going on with the first. You know, Mr. Seller, you handle that. You are a party to fraud because you know that they're about to commit fraud. If you are a party to fraud and somehow, some way, we get into a legal battle over this particular situation, and you are not covered under our LAP, our Legal Assistance Program. You're going to be out there on your own and take on all the risk and the fees to defend yourself in that particular lawsuit. So anytime you hear subordination, subject to a first loan, seller carryback, I call it the 3 S's, you run, you don't walk to your managers. So just remember that if you ever hear, they're contemplating a carryback, whatever the case is, and you know that there's a first loan, that's where it gets scary, and that's where there could be a ton of risk to the seller. So line 45 says, buyer agrees to assume the existing loans and pay all penalty or payments subsequent to close of escrow. Assumption. This could also be, obviously, a lie, depending on how this is filled out. This sale is or is not contingent upon the buyer qualifying for assumption of the existing first loan. If they are allowed to assume they must qualify, then the answer is yes, is. So this sale is contingent upon the buyer qualifying for assumption. If you see, some buyer's agent filling this out, it says this sale is not contingent upon the buyer qualifying, huge, huge, huge red flag. This assumption is contingent upon the buyer's approval of the terms and conditions of the loan being assumed within so many days of contract acceptance. Again, this assumption is contingent upon the buyer's approval of the terms and conditions of the loan being assumed within so many days of contract acceptance. You obviously don't want that to be a whole lot of days, maybe within 10 days, which would bring it within the inspection period, but you don't want the seller hanging out there and then the buyer can cancel due to buyer's non-approval, again, very subjective, non-approval of the terms and conditions of the loan. If more than one loan is being assumed, oh my goodness, this is where you really want to run. See additional terms and conditions beginning on line 65 on this addendum. Seller's liability. This sale is or is not contingent upon seller being released by lender from liability. Again, I'm not even sure why they give you an option, because if it is an assumption, in almost all cases, there are some exceptions. I think VA might be one of them, where a veteran is assuming the seller's VA loan. The seller may or may not be released from the terms or from liability for the loan being assumed, but in most cases the seller is not going to be released from that. If the buyer defaults, it's going to come back to the seller. Seller is not released from liability. Seller acknowledges that the seller may have liability to lender in the event of a buyer default. Exactly what I've been saying. Type of loss, type of loan, conventional, VA, FHA. Interest rate, again, this is on the loan being assumed. What's the current payment? Is that PI, TI? Is that just PI? Is it fixed or is it adjustable? What's the loan balance? The balance of any encumbrance being assumed is approximate, obviously, because it changes on a monthly basis. Any difference shall be reflected in the either cash down payment or in seller carryback or other. Loan transfer and assumption fees are going to be paid by whom, either the seller or the buyer. Credit evaluation. Again, the sale is or is not contingent upon seller's approval of buyer's credit. I would say always, always, always. If contingent, buyer shall provide to seller a current credit report, same language that's on the first page, and I would be real hesitant to, again, as I mentioned before, to have the seller allow the buyer to give them a credit report, because with Adobe these days, we never know if the buyer has potentially changed those credit reports in any way, shape, or form. So it's best that it comes directly from the credit reporting agency directly to the seller so that doesn't happen. Lender requirements. Buyer and seller agree to cooperate fully with lender, supply the necessary documentation to complete the assumption. Mortgage insurance. The loan assumed may include mortgage insurance, which buyer also assumes and agrees to pay exclusive of mortgage life insurance. So that's essentially it. So to be honest with you, it's been a long time since I've actually read this particular form line by line. I think it's really important that we are all familiar with what it says. The risks on a assumption, wraparound, carryback for the seller are very huge, And I think it's our duty as a listing agent to make sure that we point those out to the seller. Therefore, our Coldwell Banker advisory to the AAR's Assumption Carryback Addendum form. This is a required form anytime a seller is doing a seller carryback or a wrap or assumption. You'll see, if I go real quickly, you'll see that both sellers' signatures are required, and so are the buyer's signatures are required. I'm going to try to make this a little bit bigger as well. Okay, I know it's a little skewed, but I'll try to make it a little smaller because I know it's a little bit hard to read. Okay, this form we have probably had, I'm trying to think. Well, the date on it is 7/7, the last time it was revised, but that was 2007, but that was only because we added just a few little minor tweaks. My guess is this form has been around since probably 2003, 2004. At the time, this even dates back to our franchise dates, we had a form committee. There actually was a previous form, but it was pretty lousy. We revised the form in approximately that time, and it's the same, essentially, form used today. The intention of the committee was to, or the work group was to really point out to the seller in black and white the risks of this type of financing, because there's a ton of them. And we've been in lawsuits over this. We've been in lawsuits where our listing agent who represented the seller did not have a seller who ultimately went into a carryback situation, which was in second position below a first lien, and the buyer defaulted on the first lien, and the lender came in and foreclosed on the first. Seller had no recourse, and the seller was never advised of the risks of this type of financing. So that's the reason why this is an absolutely required form on all seller carrybacks. So it starts out, this is an advisory to the assumption/carryback addendum and the residential resale purchase contract, because obviously you're going to have the purchase contract. Well, again, line 74 is going to be marked, and you're going to have the assumption/carryback addendum form, and this is an advisory to that form, which is, I cannot express how important it is that this is a required form. So we start out with bold right away. Seller and buyer are hereby strongly advised to seek independent legal and/or financial advice as to the nature of the financing contemplated by the contract and addendum, since carryback and/or wraparound financing have extraordinary risks when compared to other types of financing. In essentially both cases where we had legal issues on carrybacks, neither seller had really any idea what they were doing on seller carryback. They did not realize the risks. It was never explained to them. And so in both cases, it cost us money, or at the time our E&O insurance carrier, money to resolve these issues. And one of them cost way over $200,000 in a mediation to resolve. So number one, it's the seller and buyer have agreed to create a promissory note and deed of trust in favor of seller and record deed of trust against the premises. That is referred back, obviously, to the assumption/carryback addendum form. Number two, seller has been advised to determine the credit worthiness of the buyer. Again, a lot of this is reiteration from the AAR form, but it's important that we knock the seller in the head with this information. Number three, seller has been advised that under Arizona law, a buyer may have no personal liability in case of a default, and that seller's only recourse may be the property as the sole and exclusive source for the repayment of the debt. Again, almost verbatim what's in that assumption/carryback addendum, but we also know that whether you're a seller or a buyer, you're not reading every single word, let alone line, in the documents that you are signing. If they don't read anything else in a carryback situation, the addendum and this advisory are the most important. Seller would need to foreclose on the note and regain title and possession of the property, and this could take as long as 3 months after initiating foreclosure proceedings. Doing so could create the need on behalf of seller to pay the costs of foreclosure, property taxes and arrears, delinquent homeowners fees, assessments, if any, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the only recourse in a default situation would be for the for the seller to get the property back, make up possibly any late payments that are due. This would be more on, again, on an assumption situation, and try to put that first loan back in good standing in order to go forward. And maybe the seller's in a financial situation they can't. And so the seller obviously would be extremely damaged in this situation. Number 4, seller has been advised that if seller is not released by lender from liability for the loan or loans being assumed or wrapped by buyer, there may be continuing liability in the event of buyer default. In addition to the above costs, if the seller forecloses and regains title to the property, seller would be required to pay any back payments due on the loans, like I just mentioned, either being assumed or wrapped, and plus pay any late charges, and default by buyer could negatively impact seller's credit rating, because in most cases, who is that first loan, who's on that loan? The seller. The seller's credit has been damaged now because of the delinquent payments. The buyer stopped paying on that, so that's going to hurt the seller and probably won't do anything to the buyer because the buyer's name is not on that loan. It's the seller and the seller's credit that could be ruined by that. Number 5, seller has been advised that most mortgage loans have due on sale clauses requiring payment in full if the property is sold or transferred. If the buyer is assuming or wrapping a loan, those lenders could call the loans due and payable and initiate foreclosure proceedings even if the payments are current. This would require a seller to pay the loans in full in order to protect the seller's interest. Seller's inability to do so could result in the loss of all rights and title to the property. Most likely the seller's not sitting there with a few $100,000 to be able to pay this loan off fully. May not be quite that much, but it could be that much or more. So again, we are trying, oops, I should need to move that forward. It's very important that we point out to the seller, I call this kind of our stupid idiot advisory. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if you really want to do this type of financing, you know, I'd like to call you a stupid idiot, but I'm not going to do that. But read between the lines on this particular form, because it really does put a lot of risk on the sellers. If the sellers sign this and they end up in a default situation, they can't come back to us and say, we didn't tell them, because not only is part of that language in the assumption/carryback addendum, but we also spelled it out again in this form. Number 6, buyer has been advised that if buyer does not qualify for the loan or loans being assumed or wrapped, certain buyer rights may be waived by the lender, including the right to impounds or refunds, the right to request documents or statements from the lender, and the possible ability to further encumber the property. So in other words, if they don't tell the seller's lender that they're assuming, that the buyer's assuming the loan, and the buyer has a question for the lender, or the buyer wants, you know, to just call up and see what the balance is, or if they want to get a third loan on the property, the seller's lender, the one in the first position, is going to say, who are you? I don't know who you are. I'm not talking to you. I'm not going to give you any information. So again, risk on the buyer side. Number 7, buyer has been advised that should the lender evoke the due on sale clause and seller is unable or unwilling to pay off the assumed or wrapped loans, buyer may lose title and possession of the property unless buyer can arrange suitable replacement financing. So now this is the problem, again, for the buyer. Seller's lender finds out about this assumption. Seller's lender goes to seller and says, hey, no, not going to allow you to do this. I'm calling it completely due and payable now. We've seen this happen. And the seller says, well, I don't have the money, so you might as well go and foreclose on the property. Therefore, now the buyer has lost their home. So obviously they've been damaged. Very last sentence, bold again, buyer and seller acknowledge by signing below they have read and understand this advisory and the advice obtained, and they agree to hold the brokers and their agents harmless from any liability associated with this financial arrangement. So again, I just wanted to point this out, these forms, go over these forms with you, because we are starting to see carrybacks again. Hopefully we're not seeing a whole lot of assumptions. I would say I probably get 1 or 2 calls or emails per year about buyers and sellers wanting to do an assumption, you know, the secret assumption. And I always tell our agents, no matter what side they're on the deal, walk away. No commission is worth it. You walk away from this deal. If the buyer and seller want to get together in a secret little corner and put together this secret assumption and not tell anybody, then we want nothing to do with that. We immediately resign our agency to our client, and we're out of there. If it's our listing, we're walking away from the commission. If it's our buyer, we're walking away from the commission. It's not worth it because you're writing big old F on your forehead for fraud and then another big L on your forehead for liability. So essentially that's all I have right now. We're gonna unmute you all, and so if you have any questions regarding any of this,
The leader has unmuted your line.
Or if you have any questions in general, please feel free to ask me. So what do you think?
Walk on rice paper.
Susan Leifer up here in Havas has got a question for you.
Hey,
Go ahead,
Martha,
Susan.
on line 22 on the assumption carryback addendum, is that a way to kind of get around the fact that they may not allow balloon payments, just saying interest only for, you know, and then the entire principal due on such and such a date?
No, let's think that out. Well, the problem is a seller, it's still going to be, because it's still going to be amortized. It still has to be amortized over a certain amount of time in order to come up with that interest-only payment. You're just not paying any principal, okay? So I'm sure the seller's not going to want to wait, you know, 10 years, let alone 30 years for the payoff. And, you know, we all know that most of the loan payments at the beginning of a loan are mostly interest. Anyway, very little principal is being paid off.
So why couldn't you just structure it that way and say, look, you're not getting any principal anyway, we're not allowing balloon payments anymore, but you can do interest only for a period of time, and then the principal's due on such and such a date 5 years down the road.
But how are you amortizing it to come up with the interest only? Over how many years are you amortizing it to get the interest only?
No amortization at all. Because like you said, in the first 5 years, depending upon what they're putting as a down payment, you're not gaining any principal anyway. I mean,
right.
They could agree to that, just saying, I agree, I'm not getting any principal. I'm just going to pay interest and at a straight rate of 8% or whatever, and then I will pay the balance of it in 3 years, 5 years, whatever.
You know, I'd have to think about that. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that. I maybe have to ask a lender on that.
Martha, would that be kind of like an arm? So
well, except for on an arm. On an arm, there's an adjustable rate. Yeah, there's an adjustable rate. And I do believe in the form it did talk about potential adjustable rates. Who knows at this point? But Paula, with an adjustable rate, you're still paying off principal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you just have your interest rate is adjusting every so often. So, I mean, that is a very good question. I'll either have to think about that or talk with the mortgage rep, but I can certainly get back to you on that answer, Sue.
I'm just thinking in the future, if they don't allow balloons, well, that could be a way out.
But it's still considered a carryback, and they would still have, the seller would still have to go through all the hoops in order to, quote, qualify the buyer.
Right.
But if they could clean their credit up in 3 to 5 years, and then they could just get their new loan in.
Right, exactly. So, any other questions?
Scary.
We used to do a lot of these in Havasu years ago, a lot of them.
Oh. Hi, Martha. This is Marty at the 101 office. I have a question.
Hi, Marty.
What's hey there. On lines 13 versus lines 15 of the addendum, I don't know if you can switch to that part on the display. Here we go. Okay. It does say on line 13, payments on this loan shall be made at least 10 days prior to the due date of any periodic payment due on any prior encumbrance. 15 says,
concurrent.
Or actually 14 and 15 says that the, let me see here, where was I reading this part? Oh, that the parties hereby instruct servicing agent not to accept any payment without all other concurrent payments. I didn't know if that kind of contradicts 13, where that states it has to be done 10 days prior, or
Right.
are you saying that all payments still have to be done at the same time, which also now means the other ones have to be done 10 days prior as from their normal due date?
That's a good question, Marty. Yeah, no, it does. I think what it is would be two different types of loans. I think the concurrent would be if there's like a wrap, there's an assumption and a carryback. So the buyer is making one payment, so that would be a concurrent payment. The first, the line 13 could say, let's say the buyer goes out and gets their own first loan, so their loan, their payment due date is the first of the month. So they're saying, okay, the loan on the carryback has to be 10 days prior to when the buyer's loan payment is due. Does that make sense?
It does. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Martha, I have a question. Joan Philpott here.
Hi, Joan. How are you?
Great, thank you. I'm just wondering if there should be some sort of a thing written in the event of a circumstance under which the buyer dies. Should there be a life insurance policy that would pay off the loan, or in the event that over time maybe they've got this loan for 5 or 6 years and the buyer loses their job and they go bankrupt, how do you ensure that your seller is still going to get paid?
Well, that's a good question too, Joan, but it would be the exact same way of any other note and deed of trust, and the lender would have the same issue if the buyer, for whatever reason, can't pay. I mean, there's still obviously not relieved from the loan necessarily, and and they have a lien on the property.
Right.
So if in a case of a death, if the heirs sell the property, then obviously they would have to pay off the lender, when the property is sold. And in the same situation, if the buyer can't make or the owner of the property can't make their payments, then obviously the lender has other recourse to go after the buyer. So essentially, it'd be almost identical as a lender's note and deed of trust. And I'm sure most of you have probably, one time or another, read every page of your own maybe note and deed of trust, which, sometimes they're 35 pages long, and many times they're legal size. I'm sure we've all read every page of that and every word of that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is something that obviously an agent would not put together, any note and deed of trust. Obviously, you'd want an attorney. Seller would probably want an attorney to draw up a note and deed of trust, because they are very extensive, very complex, and there's a lot of information in there. And I don't think any of us profess that we even understand half of what is in those documents. Any other questions? Any other questions in general? Real estate market? Yes.
It's Jim up in Havasu. The question now about lease options, lease purchase keeps coming up again, I think, in this market as things change. Can you remind everybody what we're supposed to do with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jim. We do not do lease options. Okay, let me back up. The difference between a lease option and a lease purchase. A lease purchase is a bilateral agreement by both seller and buyer that sometime in the future the buyer is going to close on that particular property. You've got a purchase contract fully executed. You've got a close of escrow date. You've got a sale price, and you just essentially have a very long close of escrow. I almost equate it to a prepossession. Then you all know that we have our own Coldwell Banker lease purchase addendum that would be required in a lease purchase situation that kind of outlines, if there's a default on the lease, then you also have a lease for the lease section. So you've got actually a purchase contract, you've got a lease agreement for the lease portion, and then essentially our lease purchase addendum ties those two documents together, okay? The problem with lease purchases is almost always they will not close. And the reason they won't close is, let's say, okay, why is the buyer even getting into a lease purchase in the first place? Well, again, maybe it's kind of like we're talking about in carrybacks. Buyer has lousy credit. He's going through a divorce. He just went through a short sale, and he's hoping, or a foreclosure, he's hoping that maybe in a year from now he will be able to qualify to purchase this house. Well, that's a big if. And the other thing is you've got many times a sale price, okay? What's the price of this house? What's the value of this house going to be in a year? Now, I don't know about all you guys, but my crystal ball is broken and has been for many, many years. I don't know how many of you can nail what a property is going to be worth a month from now, let alone a year from now. So, in our down market, at the end of the lease purchase or the lease term of a lease purchase, the buyers were saying, why do I want to purchase this property now at X price when it's actually now worth Y? In our market now, it's the opposite. What's going to happen is you pull out a sale price for a year from now out of the air, and probably it's going to be worth more than we thought it was going to be worth more. Now the seller's going to want to cancel because they can go around and repurchase or resell the house at a higher price. So that's the problem with lease purchase. Lease options is a unilateral agreement. It is not bilateral, and we don't do lease options because lease options are extremely complex. You don't have a seller-buyer. You've got an optionor, optionee. There is always consideration, quote unquote, on an option, which means buyer is paying seller X amount in order for the seller to allow or to consider the buyer exercising an option at a later date, whatever that date has been agreed to. The problem with the option, though, is it's only binding on the seller. The buyer can say, I never am going to exercise it, and they don't have to exercise it. So you've got, again, a lease. The buyer's in the property, they're tenants in the property, and then they decide at the end of the lease either they will or will not exercise it. It's only binding on the seller if the buyer chooses to exercise their option. And again, that's why it gets more complex. So I hope that answers your questions on that. But good question. Thanks for bringing it up again, Jim. So any other questions? Okay, well, I appreciate you all attending. Look forward to the next Ask the Broker in August. If you, by the way, if you have any ideas for any particular forms that you want me to discuss, please send me an email. I'd be happy to do that. If you have any further questions regarding what we went over today, please send me an email. And as always, if you have any questions about anything, please feel free to give me a call, send me an email, and I'll do my best to answer it as best I can. So I hope you all are having a great summer. Haven't melted yet. Tucson, are you getting any rain down there, Green Valley?
Yeah, definitely, on a daily basis. A lot of rain, as a matter of fact. We're getting a little bit of the haboob action that you guys experience, too.
Ah. Well, I'm sorry you're getting the haboob, but I'm glad you're getting some rain. We haven't seen it here in Phoenix, and I don't know how long. Havasu, what about you, Jim? Are you getting anything up there?
We had a slight shower just this morning, but it's kind of blown over. I guess Flagstaff got about an inch yesterday, but now it kind of and left, and sun is back out, and hopefully we'll get back up to about 120 degrees soon, so we'll be.
You can't wait, huh? Yeah.
I can wait.
Yeah, no kidding. Do we have anybody from Prescott on the line? I'm curious how Prescott's doing, especially under the terrible circumstances that have been going on for those wonderful heroes of ours that lost their lives. So just everybody, say prayers for them and their families, and wishing you all the best summer, and hopefully you all have a chance to get out of the heat, and we will be back in about a month or so. So thanks again, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Martha.
Thanks, Martha. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.